The mud of Flanders had a way of swallowing men, not just their bodies, but their spirits, their hopes, and sometimes their very sanity. It was into this mire of perpetual twilight that a new kind of dread was about to be poured, not from the German lines, but from their own command. Sergeant Miller felt the weight of it before the words were even spoken, a cold premonition that slithered down his spine as he stood at attention in Captain Harris's dugout. The air was thick with the familiar stench of damp earth, cordite, and stale sweat, but beneath it all was something new, something sour and ancient. The captain's face, usually a mask of weary resolve, was etched with a tension that went beyond the usual concerns of wire and mortar fire. He spoke of coordinates, of a forgotten trench line left off the official maps, a place where sentries had reported flickering lights that cast no shadows, and whispers that carried on a wind that did not blow. The orders were simple, a reconnaissance in force, but the subtext was a tremor in the foundation of their reality. Back in their own cramped section of the trench, Miller relayed the command to his men, watching their faces as the information settled. Private Evans, a man whose skepticism was as sharp and well-honed as his bayonet, let out a low, derisive chuckle. He leaned against the sodden timber of the revetment, his eyes narrowed. He began to recount the rumors that had been circulating among the local replacements, tales passed down from farmers who had long since fled this blighted ground. They spoke of a patch of earth that was cursed, a place where ancient battles had been fought and lost long before this great war, a place that drank the blood of the slain and was never sated. He spoke of a phantom legion, soldiers from every conflict who had ever fallen on that soil now bound together in an eternal whispering watch. Corporal Smith, a man who crossed himself before going over the top and kept a rabbit's foot, tucked in his tunic, paled visibly. His fingers fumbled for the small charm, his superstitious nature latching onto Evans's words with the grim certainty of a man reading his own obituary. He stared into the perpetual gloom of the trench, as if expecting to see the ghosts of those long-dead warriors materialize from the mist. Young Private Jenkins, barely old enough to shave, simply looked lost, his eyes wide with a fear that was more profound than the terror of shellfire. The unknown, the supernatural, was a foe against which his training offered no defense. Miller let the fear hang in the air for a moment, a tangible thing coiling around his men like the trench mist. Then he straightened his shoulders, his voice cutting through the unease with the steady, unyielding tone of a man who had long since buried his own terrors deep beneath a mountain of duty. He spoke not of curses or phantoms, but of orders. He spoke of the chain of command, of the simple, brutal arithmetic of war that demanded obedience. He reminded them that they were soldiers of the king, and that their duty was to the man beside them and the flag they served, not to the whispers of frightened peasants or the chill of a bad feeling. He met each of their eyes in turn, his own gaze a flinty bastion against the rising tide of their dread. But even as he built his wall of discipline and resolve, he could feel the cold, damp fingers of the forgotten trench reaching for them, setting the stage for a descent into a horror that no amount of duty could possibly withstand. The pale, bone-white moon offered little comfort, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to crawl across the ravaged earth of no man's land. Each step was a labor, the thick, cloying mud pulling at their boots with a greedy, sucking sound, as if the ground itself did not wish to let them pass. An unnatural chill permeated the air, a cold that had nothing to do with the night and everything to do with the place they were approaching. It seeped through their greatcoats and settled deep in their bones, a frigid presence that made the familiar horrors of the battlefield feel distant and almost benign. The usual stench of rot and cordite was absent here, replaced by a dry, ancient odor, like that of a long-sealed tomb freshly cracked open. They moved in a ragged file, their breathing the only sound beyond the squelch of mud. The silence was profound, a void where the ever-present rumble of the front had simply ceased to exist. It was in this oppressive quiet that memories of past losses began to surface, unbidden and painful. Each man saw the faces of fallen comrades in the shifting shadows, heard the ghost of their laughter in the rustle of a stray breeze. The weight of those absences made the air feel heavier, the journey longer. They were not just walking across a scarred landscape. They were marching through a graveyard of their own making, and the dead, it seemed, were keenly aware of their passage. Private Evans, his earlier skepticism now muted by the oppressive atmosphere, was the first to see it. He stopped dead, his hand rising slowly to point toward the indistinct black line of the horizon. There, nestled within the darkness, a faint, sickly green light flickered. It pulsed irregularly, like a dying heartbeat, casting no illumination on the ground around it. It was a light that seemed to consume the darkness rather than push it back. A cold fire that promised nothing but emptiness. The sight of it drained the last vestiges of color from Corporal Smith's face, his superstitious nature screaming a silent warning that this was a place where God held no sway. Then, the whispers began. At first they were so faint they could be mistaken for the blood pounding in one's own ears, or the distant sigh of the wind through shattered trees. But they grew, resolving into a susurrating chorus that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. For young Private Jenkins, the sound was a personal violation. One voice, thin and desperate, separated itself from the cacophony, a voice that echoed from a memory he kept locked away in the deepest part of his soul. It was the voice of his older brother, who had fallen at the Somme, now pleading for help from the darkness. Jenkins's breath hitched, his steps faltering as he stared wide-eyed into the void, his rifle grip tightening until his knuckles were white. Sergeant Miller felt the fabric of his squad beginning to unravel. The disciplined advance was crumbling into a hesitant, fearful shuffle. He moved among them, his own heart a frantic drum against his ribs, his voice a low, forced calm as he urged them forward. He spoke of the trench ahead as just another objective, a line on a map to be checked and cleared, but his words sounded hollow even to his own ears, swallowed by the pervasive whispers and the unsettling sight of those distant pulsating lights. The tension was a physical force, coiling around them all, pulling tighter with every step they took toward the source of the unnatural phenomena. Order was a fragile concept here, and Miller fought a desperate, silent battle to maintain it, feeling his authority slip away into the hungry, whispering dark. The trench mouth was a jagged, weeping wound in the earth, wider and deeper than any sap or communication line they had ever encountered. It did not look dug so much as torn, as if some colossal, angry hand had ripped a fissure into the world. The first step over the crumbling lip was a step out of reality, a transition into a domain that defied the known geometry of the front. The walls, impossibly sheer and high, were not mere earth and sandbags, but a strange, dark, vitrified stone that felt slick and cold to the touch, as if the trench had been glassed by some unthinkable heat and then left to fester in the cold. And upon these walls, glowing with a faint, sickly phosphorescence, were the carvings. They were not the crude graffiti of soldiers, nor the simple markers of a military engineer. These were ancient, intricate, and horrifying. Etched deep into the stone, they depicted a procession of tormented figures, their bodies contorted in agony, their faces frozen in silent screams that seemed to echo in the mind. The style was alien, the anatomy subtly wrong, suggesting beings that were almost, but not quite, human. They were locked in an eternal, forgotten war. Their forms intertwined with depictions of swirling, nebulous shapes that seemed to feed upon their suffering. The pale green light emanating from the grooves pulsed faintly, casting long, dancing shadows that made the carvings appear to writhe and shift at the edge of vision. A cold, heavy mist began to coil around their legs the moment they were fully inside, a tangible, sentient fog that slithered over the tops of their boots and clung to their trousers with a damp, possessive grip. It did not behave like any natural vapor, flowing not with the air but with a purpose of its own, pooling and streaming in a way that seemed to guide them, to herd them inexorably forward, deeper into the trench's winding, claustrophobic embrace. The air grew still and thick, the silence of no man's land now replaced by a profound, waiting hush that was somehow more terrifying. Sergeant Miller, his jaw clenched tight enough to ache, gave the order for a cautious advance, his voice a low, tight command that was swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. He gestured for a standard diamond formation, his eyes scanning the unnerving heights of the walls and the disconcerting mist at their feet. Every instinct screamed for retreat, for the simple mortal dangers of shell and bullet over this creeping supernatural dread. But discipline was a fragile raft in this sea of unease, and he clung to it with all his strength. Private Evans, however, was no longer listening. He had stopped a few yards in, his rifle hanging slack in his hands, his entire being captivated by the glowing narrative on the wall. He reached out a trembling, ungloved hand, his fingers hovering just inches from the stone, tracing the outline of a figure whose head was thrown back in a rictus of pain. His lips moved silently at first, then formed words, a low, breathy mutter that was barely audible. He spoke not of German machine guns or artillery barrages, but of forgotten wars, of empires of dust and legions of bone, of conflicts so ancient they predated the very soil of Flanders. His skepticism had been incinerated in the face of this impossible evidence, replaced by a terrifying, rapturous understanding. He was reading the history of this cursed place, and the story was one of endless consuming torment, a cycle of death that their own war had merely continued. The deeper they pressed into the trench's throat, the thicker the mist became, coiling up past their knees now, a sentient, chilling presence that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It deadened sound, muffling their footsteps and their ragged breathing until each man felt terrifyingly isolated, a lone soul adrift in a sea of shifting, pearlescent gray. And through this muffling shroud, the whispers returned, no longer a distant susurration but a clear, chilling chorus. They were no longer abstract sounds, they were distinct, recognizable voices, a hellish tapestry woven from the memories of every man present, the pleas of fallen comrades, the guttural curses of long-dead German soldiers, the sobbing of boys who had died afraid, all of them swirled together, a cacophony of the dead that pressed in from all sides. For Private Jenkins, the assault was personal and devastating. The voice of his brother, which had been a faint echo on the approach, now rang with a painful, heartbreaking clarity. It was no longer a memory, but a presence. "Thomas? Thomas, help me! Don't leave me here in the dark!" The voice cried, the words laced with a terror that Jenkins remembered from their childhood, from storms and nightmares. The young soldier staggered, his rifle clattering against the vitrified stone wall. He sank to his knees, the mist swirling around his waist as he buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with ragged, silent sobs. He called out his brother's name, a broken whisper lost in the din, his sanity fraying at the edges as the spectral plea repeated, over and over, a torturous loop from beyond the grave. Corporal Smith, trying to shake off his own superstitious dread, saw movement from the corner of his eye, a patch of deeper shadow detaching itself from the wall. It resolved into a tall, gaunt figure, its features obscured, but its silhouette unmistakably that of a German Stahlhelm. It was the boy from the raid at Ypres, the one whose throat Smith had cut in the frantic, close-quarters dark. The figure did not advance, but simply stood, one pale, translucent hand beckoning slowly, invitingly. A cold fury, born of guilt and terror, seized Smith. He raised his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger, and roared a challenge into the mist. The shot never came. As quickly as it had appeared, the shadowy figure dissolved, not fading, but seeming to be pulled apart into strands of mist that were eagerly absorbed by the swirling fog at his feet. He was left pointing his weapon at empty air, his heart hammering against his ribs, the ghost of a dead boy's eyes staring back at him from his memory. Throughout this chaos, Sergeant Miller fought to maintain a semblance of control. He reached for his compass, its brass casing cold against his palm, needing a fixed point in this shifting nightmare. He snapped it open, expecting the needle to point their way back to the world they had left behind. Instead, the needle spun in a frantic, dizzying circle, whirling without slowing, without ever settling. It was not broken, it was overwhelmed, its simple magnetic logic rendered useless by the unnatural forces saturating the trench. A cold knot of pure dread tightened in Miller's stomach. They were not just lost, they were unmoored, cut adrift from reality itself, guided only by the malevolent will of the mist and the tormenting whispers of the dead. Disorientation was now their permanent state, and the trench, it seemed, had only just begun to show them its horrors. The trench floor began to slope downward with a steep, unnatural gradient, angling into an abyssal darkness that swallowed the feeble glow of the carvings. It was a descent not just into the earth, but into a realm where time and space seemed to unravel. The air grew colder with every step, a biting chill that seeped through wool and flesh to gnaw at the marrow of their bones. The whispers intensified, coiling around them like spectral vines, their promises and pleas now threaded with a sinister familiarity. Private Evans, who had been muttering at the walls, now began to answer them. His head cocked to one side as if listening to a distant command, his responses a series of jerky staccato whispers. Yes, I see. The chorus must be fed. His movements became marionette-like, his feet dragging then shuffling in a rhythm that was not his own. His eyes fixed on the void ahead with a glazed, unsettling vacancy. Sergeant Miller watched the transformation with a rising tide of despair. He moved to Evans's side, gripping his shoulder, trying to physically shake him back to reality. But the man's flesh was cold, his muscles rigid. Miller's voice, when he spoke, was a raw, desperate instrument against the whispering tide. He tried to rally what was left of his squad, his words painting pictures of a world they had almost forgotten. He spoke of warm English pubs, with firelight dancing on polished wood, of the sweet, simple taste of a pint of bitter, of green fields under a summer sun untouched by shell holes. He described the sound of church bells on a Sunday morning, the feel of a letter from home, the memory of a woman's smile. He built these fragile monuments of memory, brick by brick, hoping to construct a bulwark against the encroaching madness. But the trench was an artist of despair, and its canvas was the very stone around them. The glowing carvings began to shift. The ancient, tormented figures seemed to writhe with new specific agonies. A scene depicting a warrior pierced by spears now mirrored Corporal Smith's memory of a bayonet wound he'd received at Mons. Another, showing a figure weeping over a fallen comrade, was a perfect echo of Jenkins's breakdown over his spectral brother. The nebulous, consuming shapes in the carvings grew more defined, their forms now reflecting the mist that coiled at their feet, the same mist that seemed to drink their warmth and their will. The ancient suffering etched into the walls was no longer a historical horror, it was a living, breathing prophecy, and they were the newest figures to be added to its ghastly tableau. Their own deepest fears and freshest wounds were being reflected back at them, proving that their pain was not unique, but merely part of an endless, repeating cycle of torment in this place that fed on anguish. The descent was not just physical, it was a plunge into a reflection of their own damned souls, and the bottom was nowhere in sight. The ghost of the German boy from Ypres was no longer a fleeting shadow. He walked beside Corporal Smith, a constant, silent companion in the trench's oppressive gloom. His form was not transparent but substantial. The mud of no man's land still caked on his faded uniform, the fatal wound at his throat a dark, wet gash that seemed to pulse in time with the trench's own sickly light. He did not speak, but his eyes, wide and accusing, held a universe of silent pleading. He would point, not with a finger, but with the whole of his being, directing Smith's gaze toward a fissure in the vitrified wall, a narrow, dark alcove that the mist seemed to avoid. The other voices, the chorus of the dead, faded into a dull roar whenever the boy was near, as if granting this one specter a private audience. A profound, unnatural compulsion seized Smith. The superstitious terror that had once made him clutch his rabbit's foot was gone, replaced by a hollow, irresistible pull. Miller shouted commands to hold position, were distant echoes, meaningless noises. Evans's jerky whispers and Jenkins's quiet weeping were part of another world. The only reality was the boy's silent beckoning and the promise of something. Answers, forgiveness, or simply an end, waiting within that dark crevice. His feet moved of their own accord, carrying him away from the dim safety of the squad's loose formation drawn toward the alcove like iron to a lodestone. The alcove was not empty. It was a shallow recess, and at its back, the floor simply fell away into a black circular pit. There was no rim, no warning. The solid-looking ground gave the illusion of continuity until one was upon it. The German boy stood at the very edge, his form now shimmering, and for the first time he smiled, a small sad twist of the lips, before he dissolved into a wisp of mist that drifted down into the void. Smith, his eyes locked on the spot where the apparition had vanished, took one final fateful step. A strong, calloused hand closed like a vice on the strap of his webbing, yanking him backward with brutal force. He stumbled, his boots skidding on the lip of the pit, sending a shower of loose stones clattering into the abyss. They fell for a long time, the sound of their impact never coming. Sergeant Miller, his face a mask of sweat and fury, hauled Smith away from the edge, shoving him hard against the opposite wall. The corporal slid down to the cold stone floor, his body trembling uncontrollably, his breath coming in ragged, shuddering gasps. The spell was broken. The immediate, physical danger had shattered the ghost's hold, but the psychological wound was deep and bleeding. The rescue, however, had come at a cost. The brief struggle and the near fall seemed to have agitated the very atmosphere of the trench. The whispers returned with a vengeance, but their texture had changed. They were no longer just the voices of their own recent dead. Now, layered beneath the familiar pleas, were older, more ragged tones. They spoke in languages Smith did not recognize, in archaic forms of French and English, the clipped Latin of a Roman legionary, the guttural cries of warriors from ages of spear and shield. They were the echoes of all the fallen, a timeline of suffering stretching back centuries, all trapped here, all adding their anguish to the chorus. The squad's psychological torment was no longer a personal haunting, it was a historical damnation. They were not just listening to ghosts, they were drowning in the accumulated grief of every soul this cursed ground had ever claimed, and the weight of it was enough to crush the strongest spirit. It began with a subtle shift in his posture, a slackening of the shoulders that had been perpetually tensed for a fight. Private Evans, who had been the squad's most vocal skeptic, now moved with a strange fluid lethargy, his boots scuffing the vitrified stone in a rhythm that was not his own. The others noticed the change before they understood its meaning. His head, which had been constantly swiveling, assessing threats real and imagined, now remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on some unseen point deep within the trench's perpetual twilight. The vibrant, cynical light in his eyes was the first thing to die, replaced by a milky, glazed film that made his stare as depthless and vacant as a corpse's. The pallor followed, a leaching of color that was horrifyingly swift. The healthy, wind-burned ruddiness of his cheeks faded to a waxy, bloodless white, the tone of old parchment or fungus growing in the dark. The veins beneath his skin stood out in a tracery of sickly blue, a stark map of a body that no longer seemed to contain warm, living blood. When Miller barked an order for him to check their rear, Evans did not startle, did not even turn. He simply continued his steady, plodding march, his movements possessing a new, unnatural stiffness, as if his joints had been replaced with poorly oiled clockwork. His arms swung in a short, metronomic arc, his fingers curled into loose, useless claws. It was the voice, however, that truly shattered the last remnants of their composure. When Corporal Smith, shaken from his own near fall, reached out and gripped Evans's arm, the private finally stopped. He turned his head with a slow, deliberate creak, the milky eyes settling on Smith's face without a flicker of recognition. His lips parted, and a sound emerged that was devoid of all emotion, all inflection, a flat, toneless drone that seemed to be filtered through layers of earth and time. He was not speaking to Smith, or to any of them. He was broadcasting. "The chorus welcomes new voices," he intoned, the words devoid of meaning yet heavy with menace. "Their pain will be our harmony, their silence, our peace. We must go deeper. We must all join the chorus." Sergeant Miller shouted his name, a raw, desperate plea. Evans, Private Evans, snap out of it. The name, which had been his identity for 22 years, meant nothing now. It was just another sound, in the cacophony of whispers. Evans's head tilted, a grotesque parody of curiosity, and from his mouth came not a reply, but a perfect echo of the whispers that swirled around them, a fragmented plea from a long-dead Highlander, a guttural curse from a fallen German, the sobbing of Jenkins's brother. He was no longer a man responding to his environment. He was a conduit, a hollow vessel through which the trench's accumulated sorrow now flowed. The other soldiers watched in frozen horror, their own fears momentarily eclipsed by the visceral terror of witnessing a comrade's humanity being systematically erased. He was becoming part of the trench itself, a new feature in its gallery of torments, a living monument to the entity's power. He no longer belonged to their world of memory and duty. He belonged to the whispers, and as he turned back to face the descending darkness, his stiff, mechanical steps perfectly in time with some unheard dreadful rhythm, they knew with a chilling certainty that the Private Evans they had known was gone, and the thing that wore his skin was now their guide, leading them ever deeper into the heart of the entity's hunger. The transformation of Private Evans had left a void where certainty once resided, a hollowed-out space in the squad's collective spirit that the whispers rushed to fill. They swelled from a pervasive murmur to a deafening roar, a symphony of the damned that vibrated through the cold stone beneath their feet and the frigid air in their lungs. This was no longer a collection of individual ghosts or personal hauntings. It was a unified force, a chorus of countless voices speaking as one, their message a siren song of impossible promises. They spoke of an end to pain, a release from the terror of the trenches, a final peaceful silence where the thunder of artillery would never be heard again. They promised answers to questions the men had never dared to ask: why they had survived when others fell, what purpose their suffering served, what lay beyond the final choking gasp of a battlefield death. For Private Jenkins, already broken by the phantom cries of his brother, the cacophony became a single clarion call, the voice of his sibling separated from the others, no longer pleading but offering, its tone shifting from desperation to a soothing, hypnotic calm. "It's quiet here, Thomas," it whispered. "Sweet as poison. No more guns. No more mud. Just rest. Come and rest with me." The words wrapped around Jenkins's fractured mind, a balm on the raw nerve of his grief. The cold, the fear, the crushing weight of Miller's discipline, it all melted away under the voice's gentle insistence. His eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, lost their last vestige of reason, filling instead with a desperate yearning light. With a choked cry that was half sob, half triumphant shout, Jenkins broke. He shoved past Corporal Smith, his movements fueled by a sudden frantic energy, and sprinted into the clinging mist, following the sound of his brother's voice as it led him down a branching side passage of the trench. His flight was a spark on a powder trail. The spell of the chorus, no longer resisted by Evans's terrifying example, swept through the remaining men. Another private, a man named Cooper, who had been haunted by the memory of leaving a wounded friend behind at Passchendaele, let out a strangled gasp and lurched after Jenkins, his own personal ghost calling him home. Then another followed, and another, their discipline dissolving like sugar in water, their individual terrors and guilts becoming hooks in their souls, reeling them into the darkness. Sergeant Miller's commands were lost, swallowed by the torrent of sound. He shouted until his throat was raw, grabbing at the straps and sleeves of the men as they stumbled past him. But his grip was like trying to hold back the tide with bare hands. They did not fight him, they simply flowed around him, their eyes mirroring Jenkins' vacant yearning. their bodies moving with the same single-minded compulsion. The squad, the unit he had held together through gas attacks and machine gun fire, splintered apart in seconds under this supernatural pressure. Each man was a planet-breaking orbit, drawn by the irresistible gravity of his own personal ghost, lured deeper into the labyrinth by the promise of a peace that the living world could never provide. Miller stood alone in the swirling mist, the frantic spinning needle of his compass forgotten in his hand, watching the last of his men disappear into the gloom, the triumphant whispers of the trench closing in around him like a victory chant. The trench walls finally fell away, opening into a cavern so vast, its ceiling was lost in a swirling canopy of phosphorescent mist. This was no man-made dugout. It was a natural, subterranean cathedral, a hollowed-out heart in the body of the cursed earth. The air hummed with a low, resonant thrum, a vibration that was felt in the teeth and bones more than heard by the ears. At the center of the chamber, the source of the unearthly illumination pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat. It was not a flame or a lamp, but a core of raw, ethereal light, suspended in midair like a captive star. Its glow was a sickly, mesmerizing green, waxing and waning in time with the thrumming vibration, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. Each pulse washed over the remaining soldiers, Miller, Smith, and a handful of others, like a physical wave, a pressure that pushed at the edges of their sanity. The walls of this colossal chamber were not the slick, vitrified stone of the trench, but a dark, porous rock that seemed to absorb the light. And upon this absorbing canvas, the carvings reached their horrific crescendo. They were larger, more detailed, and infinitely more terrible. They depicted a single, recurring entity, a vast, amorphous shape of swirling darkness and tendrils. Its form suggested rather than defined. It was shown towering over battlefields from every age, from clashes of Bronze Age warriors to the familiar hellscape of the Western Front. In every scene, its tendrils were plunged into the chests of the fallen, not to kill, but to consume. From the mouths of the victims, not blood, but wispy, soul stuff was drawn, siphoned into the central mass of the entity. The carvings told a story not of battle, but of harvest. This place was a larder, and the entity was the ancient patient farmer, feeding on the anguish of the slain for centuries. The mist that had been their constant companion now grew thick and purposeful, coalescing into distinct, humanoid shapes that drifted through the cavern like lost patrols. These were not vague phantoms. They were perfect, silent replicas of the dead. Miller saw the spectral form of his old lance corporal, the man's face frozen in the moment a sniper's bullet had taken him. Smith stared, horrified, as the German boy from Ypres materialized a few yards away, standing silently beside a mist shape of a Roman legionary, both of them staring ahead with the same empty eyes. The mist forms did not speak or act. They were simply there, a gallery of the consumed, their presence a silent testament to the entity's endless appetite. A cold realization, colder than the chamber's air, gripped Sergeant Miller. They were not alone with the echoes of the dead. As his eyes adjusted to the pulsating gloom, he saw them, shadowy figures moving at the very periphery of the light. They were not mist forms, they were solid, their movement smooth and coordinated. They slipped between the stone pillars that supported the cavern, their forms blending seamlessly with the darkness, only visible as a flicker of deeper black against the shadows. They did not advance, but they were watching, a silent, predatory audience to the squad's final act. They were the changed ones, the fully consumed, and they were herding what was left of his men toward the pulsating heart of the light, toward the entity that had been waiting for them all along. The pulsating light at the chamber's core did not merely illuminate, it invaded. A final, violent thrum sent out a shockwave of pure energy that bypassed the ears and struck directly at the mind. Sergeant Miller's vision dissolved into a torrent of images, a flood of historical suffering that was not seen but experienced. He was no longer a man standing in a cavern. He was a Roman auxiliary, his sandals slipping in the mud of a forgotten Germanic forest as a shadow with teeth of mist drank his final breath. He was a knight at Agincourt, choking on the mud of a rain-soaked field, feeling his soul unravel like thread from a spool as the same presence fed. He was every soldier who had ever fallen on this blood-soaked patch of earth, their individual deaths mere meals in a feast that had lasted 2,000 years. The trench was not a cursed place. It was a wound, a gateway through which a parasitic entity, a consciousness of pure, ancient hunger, had attached itself to the world, using the mass death of battle as its sustenance. The flickering lights, the whispering voices, they were not hauntings but lures, the anglerfish's glow in the deep, designed to draw more sustenance into its reach. From the swirling mist near the pulsating core, a figure emerged, its movements fluid and unnervingly precise. It was Private Evans, or the vessel that had once contained him. His waxy skin seemed to glow with an internal reflection of the entity's light, and his eyes were now solid orbs of the same sickly green. When he spoke, his voice was a chorus, layered with the thousands of consumed souls, a dry rustle of leaves, and a low rumble of distant cannon fire. "The struggle is a relic of your fleeting lives," the chorus intoned through his lips, the sound seeming to emanate from the very air around them. "Surrender the pain, surrender the fear. Let your individual notes be absorbed into the eternal chorus. In unity, there is no loss. In silence, there is no war. Your humanity is a cage. We offer you the freedom of the void." Corporal Smith felt the promise of that void as a physical pull, a seductive undertow tugging at the foundations of his will. The memory of the German boy's beckoning hand was now replaced by this overwhelming invitation to simply cease, to let go of the guilt, the terror, the bone-deep weariness of years in the trenches. The entity's call was a siren song of oblivion, and a part of him, a part worn thin by horror and loss, yearned to answer. He could feel his own memories beginning to loosen, their sharp edges softening, ready to be dissolved into the great, soulless whole. He took a half step forward, his rifle slipping from his numb fingers to clatter on the stone floor, the sound startlingly small and insignificant in the vast chamber. Resistance felt like a childish act, a pointless fight against the tide of history itself. The pull was not one of force, but of insidious logic, offering an end to all struggle, and in that moment, it felt utterly, terrifyingly irresistible. The promise of an end to pain was a hook set deep in their souls, and one by one the soldiers succumbed. Private Jenkins, who had been lured by his brother's spectral voice, was the first to fall completely. He stopped his frantic, weeping search and stood perfectly still, his head tilted as if listening to a final soothing command. Then, a dreadful vacancy claimed his face. His eyes, once bright with youthful fear, hollowed out, the pupils dilating into vast black pools that reflected nothing of the chamber's pulsating light. The color drained from his skin, leaving it the pale, waxy tone of a corpse prepared for burial. His breathing, which had been ragged with sobs, simply ceased, yet he remained standing. When he moved, it was with the same stiff, marionette-like precision as Evans, his steps falling into a perfect synchronized rhythm with the other changed soldier. He was no longer a boy mourning his brother. He was another instrument in the entity's silent, ghastly orchestra. Another man, Private Cooper, followed. He let out a long, shuddering sigh, a final exhalation of self, and the tension left his body all at once. His shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in release. His eyes filmed over, their intelligent light extinguished, and he shuffled forward to join the growing rank of pale, hollow-eyed figures standing guard around the pulsating core. They moved as one organism, a single consciousness distributed across multiple bodies, their individuality erased, their personal wars finally and terribly over. Sergeant Miller watched the dissolution of his squad with a mounting, frantic horror. He was an island of crumbling sanity in a sea of surrendering minds. He fought back with the only weapons he had left, memory. He clawed at the shreds of his past, gripping the image of his wife, Eleanor. He could almost feel the crisp parchment of her letters in his hands, smell the faint scent of lavender she always pressed between the pages. He pictured her face, not as a static image, but in motion, laughing in their sun-dappled garden, her brow furrowed in concentration as she sewed, her eyes soft with concern the day he left for the front. He built a fortress in his mind with these moments, each memory a stone in the wall against the whispering tide. He recited the contents of her last letter in his head, the mundane details of a village fete and a new litter of kittens, clinging to their normalcy as a lifeline. But the voices were tireless, and their assault was insidious. They did not shout, they reasoned. They wove his own memories into their promises, twisting them into weapons. The image of Eleanor's smile was overlaid with the whisper that he would never see it again, that the war would claim him as it had claimed so many others, leaving her with only a telegram and a memory. The entity offered a different end. It promised he would never have to feel the grief of that parting, the guilt of his own survival, the bone-deep exhaustion that was his constant companion. It whispered of a peace where the memory of her smile could exist without the accompanying pain of its loss, a state of perfect, painless stasis. The war's torment, the voices crooned, was a fire that could be extinguished forever. All he had to do was stop fighting. All he had to do was let go. The wall of memory began to crack, not from a single blow, but from the relentless, dripping erosion of that terrible, logical promise. His grip on Eleanor's face began to slip, the details blurring, as the hollow peace offered by the void beckoned him inward, a single, frayed thread of Sergeant Miller's will snapped taut. The sight of his men, Jenkins, Cooper, the others, standing as pale, breathing statues in that ghastly green light, their humanity siphoned away, ignited a final desperate ember of defiance. He would not become part of the chorus. He would not surrender to the void. The memory of Eleanor's face, though blurred at the edges by the whispering promises, flared once more. A final beacon in the consuming dark. He had to get out. He had to lead what was left of them back to the surface, back to the world of sun and rain and pain, a world whose very suffering was now preferable to this terrible silent peace. He turned from the pulsating core, his movements sharp and purposeful against the languid, synchronized sway of the changed soldiers. He gripped Corporal Smith's arm, the man's body trembling with the effort of his own internal war. "With me, Corporal," Miller hissed, his voice a raw scrape in the humming silence. "We're leaving." He gestured to the two other privates who still had a flicker of awareness behind their eyes, men named Clark and Hayes, who flinched at his touch as if waking from a deep sleep. They formed a ragged, terrified knot around him, their backs to the entity's heart, their faces turned toward the dark archway through which they had entered the chamber. But the trench had no intention of releasing its newest acquisitions. As Miller took his first step toward escape, the changed soldiers moved. It was not an aggressive charge, but a passive, unnerving coordination that was far more terrifying. Evans, Jenkins, and the others did not raise their weapons or shout challenges. They simply shifted, their bodies flowing like water, to form a solid, silent wall across the chamber's exit. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their hollow eyes fixed on nothing and everything, a living barricade of pallid flesh and vacant stares. Their perfect, unbreathing stillness was a more formidable obstacle than any barbed wire or machine gun nest. A struggle ensued, a frantic, horrifying pantomime. Miller and Smith tried to shove their way through, grabbing the arms of their former comrades, but the changed soldiers were immovable, their bodies unnaturally heavy and rigid. Clark, in a surge of panic, swung the butt of his rifle at Evans's head. The crack of wood against bone was sickeningly loud, and Evans's head snapped to the side. But there was no cry of pain, no spurt of blood. The head slowly righted itself, the milky eyes unblinking, the jaw already seeming to reset with a faint, grinding sound. The message was clear. Violence was meaningless here. It was then that Miller made his decision. His hand went to his webbing, his fingers closing around the cool, familiar pineapple shape of a Mills bomb. He pulled the pin, the metallic ping a shockingly mundane sound in the supernatural hush. "Grenade! Take cover!" he roared, not for the changed soldiers, but for Smith, Clark, and Hayes. He hurled the bomb not at the men, but at the vitrified wall just beside the blocked archway, hoping to blast a new opening. The explosion was a brief, deafening flower of fire and concussive force in the chamber. Shrapnel and chunks of stone scythed through the air. Several of the changed soldiers caught the full force of the blast. Jenkins was thrown backward, his torso a ruined mess of cloth and pale bloodless flesh. Another had his leg shredded below the knee. For a single heart-lifting moment, a gap appeared in their line. "Go, now!" Miller screamed, shoving his stunned men toward the opening. But the hope was as fleeting as the flash of the explosion. The thick, coiling mist that permeated the trench, which had retreated from the blast, now surged forward with an almost sentient purpose. It flowed over the wounded changed ones, enveloping them in a swirling, pearlescent shroud. Miller watched, his blood running cold, as the terrible damage began to reverse itself. The shrapnel wounds in Jenkins's torso sealed over, the pale skin knitting together without a scar. The leg of the other soldier, a mangled ruin moments before, reformed from the mist itself, the bone and sinew weaving back into place until it was whole and unmarked. Within seconds, they were rising, their movements just as stiff and coordinated as before, their hollow eyes locking once more on the escapees. The mist was not just a guide or an atmosphere, it was a healing agent, a regenerative force that made the entity's vessels nearly invulnerable. The opening in their line closed, the silent, impassive wall reforming, stronger and more hopeless than before. The grenade had bought them only a moment, and the price was the chilling realization that the thing that held his men could not be killed by any weapon they possessed. The concept of days had dissolved in the trench's perpetual pulsating twilight. Time was not a measure of hours, but a slow, grinding erosion of will, marked only by the rhythmic thrum of the entity's heart and the silent, multiplying ranks of the changed. Sergeant Miller's world had shrunk to a tiny, defiant core of self, a fortress under endless siege by the whispering promises of peace. He, Corporal Smith, and privates, Clark and Hayes, were the last bastions, huddled together in a shallow alcove away from the main chamber, their bodies shivering with a cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the proximity of the void. They took turns sleeping in fitful, terror-filled bursts, one always standing watch against the pale, silent sentinels who would occasionally drift near, their hollow eyes scanning, their presence a constant, passive pressure to surrender. The break came not from a plan, but from a shift in the trench's attention. The pulsating light at the chamber's core flared with a sudden, violent intensity, and the chorus of whispers swelled into a deafening roar, a cacophony of thousands of souls screaming in unison. The changed soldiers, who had been standing their silent guard, all turned as one toward the light, their bodies swaying in a unified, rapturous rhythm. It was a distraction, a moment where the entity's focus was turned inward, perhaps digesting some new horror from the world above. It was their only chance. Miller did not need to shout the order. A single desperate look passed between the four men, a final spark of shared humanity in the oppressive gloom. They moved, scrambling from their alcove and along the chamber's perimeter, their backs pressed against the cold, porous rock. They did not head for the main archway, which was now thronged with the entranced changed, but for a narrow, almost invisible fissure Miller had noted days before, a crack that promised not the heart of the trench, but an upward slope. They squeezed into the tight passage, the stones scraping against their shoulders, the darkness absolute save for the faint, sickly green glow reflecting from behind them. They climbed, not with the strength of soldiers, but with the frantic, scrabbling desperation of animals escaping a trap, their muscles screaming in protest after days of inactivity and terror. Then, after an eternity of groping through claustrophobic darkness, Miller's outstretched hand, scrabbling for a hold, closed not on cold stone, but on a tangled wet root. A moment later, A sliver of searing, blinding white light cut through the blackness from above. It was so shockingly bright, so alien after the trench's perpetual gloom, that it felt like a physical blow. He pushed upward, his head and shoulders bursting through a thicket of brambles and into the open air. The world erupted into a chaos of sensation. The gray, cloud-choked sky was an overwhelming expanse after the cavern's ceiling. A cold, clean rain fell, stinging his face and washing the trench's grime from his skin. The air, thick with the smell of wet earth and decay, was like a fine wine after the tomb-dry, ancient stench below. He hauled himself out, collapsing onto the churned, muddy earth of a shell-scarred field, his body racked with violent, shuddering sobs of relief and disorientation. Clark and Hayes followed, then Smith, each of them emerging like newborns, blinking and gasping, their hands shielding their eyes from the painful brilliance of daylight. They were emaciated, their uniforms hanging in tatters, their faces gaunt and etched with a horror that sleep would never erase. They had no memory of the passage of time, no idea if they had been underground for 3 days or 3 weeks. The world they had returned to was the same, yet utterly, fundamentally changed. As they lay there, gulping the clean air, the fissure behind them disgorged its other inhabitants. One by one the changed soldiers emerged. Evans first, then Jenkins, then the others. They climbed out with the same unnerving, fluid grace they had displayed below, their movements perfectly synchronized, their pale, waxy skin looking grotesquely out of place in the natural light. They did not squint or shield their eyes. They simply stood in the rain, their hollow gazes fixed on the small group of survivors, their silence more threatening than any weapon. They had followed, not in pursuit, but as a placid, inevitable extension of the trench itself, a piece of the horror that had now, irrevocably, breached the surface world. The journey back to the British lines was a surreal procession through a landscape of familiar horrors made strange by their absence of fear. Sergeant Miller and his 3 shaken companions stumbled through the mud, their bodies operating on a last reserve of animal instinct, their minds still trapped in the echoing silence of the trench. Behind them, the changed soldiers moved in a silent, single-file column, their steps unnervingly precise and coordinated, their boots making no sound in the churned earth. They did not stumble or waver, their pale forms gliding through the mist and rain like a line of ghosts on parade. The sentries at the forward listening post did not challenge them. They simply stared, their mouths agape, as the spectral squad passed through the wire without a word, their hollow eyes looking straight ahead, seeing everything and nothing. The main trench line, when they reached it, was a cacophony of life that felt alien and assaultive after the tomb quiet of the entity's domain. The rumble of a distant artillery battery, the clatter of a field kitchen, the rough, living banter of soldiers, all of it was a jarring, overwhelming shock to the senses. The normalcy of it was a lie they could no longer believe. As the ragged group and their silent entourage moved through the communication trench, a hush fell in their wake. Conversations died mid-sentence. Pipes were lowered from open mouths. The work of repairing duckboards and cleaning rifles ceased entirely. Every eye was drawn to the returning squad, or more precisely, to the things that walked among them. The shock was not for their tattered uniforms or emaciated frames, common enough sights in the trenches. It was for their eyes. Miller, Smith, Clark, and Hayes had the wide, shattered stares of men who had gazed into an abyss. But the others, their eyes were hollow, depthless pits, like windows into an empty room. Their skin was a uniform, waxy white, utterly devoid of the ruddiness of life or the grime of the front. And their gait, a stiff, robotic, perfectly synchronized march, was a blasphemy against the weary, individual shuffles of the living soldiers around them. They moved as a single organism, a machine of flesh and bone, their silence a heavier weight than any barrage. A corporal dropped a crate of rations, the clatter unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. A young private backed away, crossing himself fervently. The commotion reached Captain Harris in his dugout. He emerged, his face a mask of officious concern that quickly curdled into stark alarm as he took in the scene. His eyes swept over the broken survivors, and then fixed on the pallid, silent figures of Evans and Jenkins. He saw no recognition in their faces, no reaction to his rank or their surroundings. They were statues, breathing monuments to something unspeakable. "Sergeant Miller," Harris barked, his voice tight with the confusion he was trying to mask with authority. "Report. What is the meaning of this? What has happened to your men?" Miller tried to form words, to shape the inexpressible horror into a military debriefing. But his throat was a desert, his mind a scrambled collection of green light and whispering promises. Before he could speak, one of the changed soldiers, Private Evans, tilted his head. His lips parted, and a sound emerged. Not a voice, but a dry, rustling whisper, like dead leaves skittering over stone. The words were fragmented, torn from the chorus of the damned. The chorus, "Hungers," the whisper seeped out, "The gateway must be fed, endless war." Then Jenkins, without turning his head, added his own hollow whisper, a perfect echo, "Join us," in the silence. The other changed ones remained mute, but their collective presence was an affirmation. They were not here to report. They were here to testify to a horror that lay beyond the comprehension of the living. They stood in their perfect, unnerving line, whispering their cryptic, terrifying fragments, while the entire section of the trench looked on in frozen, disbelieving dread. The war, it seemed, had just introduced a new, unimaginable front. The medical tent was an island of sterile, frantic order in the sea of mud and chaos that was the field hospital, but the squad's arrival turned it into a chamber of profound, unsettling dread. They were not treated as wounded men, but as specimens, anomalies that defied the very definitions of life and death. The orderlies, their faces pale beneath the harsh glow of hurricane lamps, handled the changed soldiers with a palpable, trembling fear, their hands hesitating before making contact with the waxy, cold skin. Evans, Jenkins, and the others offered no resistance, their bodies moving with a passive, pliable stiffness as they were guided onto cots, their hollow eyes staring at the canvas ceiling as if it were the infinite void of the trench. The doctors, men who had seen every horror the war could inflict, from shredded limbs to gas-ravaged lungs, found themselves confronted with a medical impossibility. Stethoscopes pressed to chests detected no heartbeat, no whisper of air in the lungs. Fingers pressed to carotid arteries felt only a chilling, absolute stillness. There was no pulse, no respiration, yet the bodies were animate, their chests rising and falling in a slow, synchronized rhythm that had nothing to do with breath. Thermometers registered a temperature far below that of a living human, a cold that seemed to radiate from the core of their being. They were biologically inert, yet they sat, stood, and moved when directed, a collection of perfectly preserved, functioning corpses. The head physician, a seasoned major with tired eyes, could only mutter catalepsy and severe shock, his medical training providing no vocabulary for the reality before him. Private Evans, laid out on his cot, began to speak. It was not the fragmented whispers of the trench, but a low, rhythmic monotone, a broken record of damnation. "The entity's hunger is eternal," he intoned, his gaze fixed on nothing. "The chorus must grow. The gateway must be fed." He repeated the phrases with metronomic regularity, each iteration draining a little more color from the faces of the medical staff. It was a statement of fact, devoid of plea or explanation, a cold, logical pronouncement of their fate. In stark, silent contrast, Private Jenkins simply lay still, his body arranged by the orderlies, his head turned to stare at the blank canvas wall of the tent. His hollow eyes did not blink, his expression did not change. He was a portrait of absolute vacancy, a soul that had been utterly scoured clean, leaving behind only a vessel waiting for a command. The profound stillness of his form was more disturbing than Evans's chanting. It was the silence of an extinguished star. Sergeant Miller, quarantined in a separate section with Smith, Clark, and Hayes, fought his own battle. A captain from intelligence, A man with a clean uniform and a clipboard sat across from him, his expression a mixture of professional skepticism and thinly veiled alarm. Miller tried to form the words, to describe the impossible depth of the trench, the shifting carvings, the pulsating light, the entity that fed on souls. He spoke of the whispers and the change, his voice cracking with the effort of conveying a horror that felt like a fever dream. But the captain's eyes glazed over. He scribbled notes, his pen scratching out words like mass hysteria, battle fatigue, and traumatic neurosis. He nodded, offering platitudes about the strain of command and the effects of prolonged shelling. Miller's desperate, truthful account was being systematically filed away as a case of severe shell shock, his warning of an ancient, parasitic evil dismissed as the ravings of a broken mind. The real quarantine, he realized with a sinking despair, was not of the body, but of the truth, locked away behind the impenetrable walls of human disbelief. The quarantine tent became a focal point of dread, a blight upon the bustling, mud-choked normality of the field hospital. As night fell, the changed soldiers within did not sleep, but stood or sat in their unnerving, synchronized stillness, their pale forms faintly visible through the canvas, like ghosts in a lantern show. It was then that the first guard, a young private named Davies, heard it, a low, susurrating whisper that seemed to emanate not from within the tent, but from the very air around it. It was the same dry, rustling chorus from the trench, a sound that carried the chill of deep earth and forgotten suffering. He called his companion, Corporal Teague, and together they stood vigil, their rifles held tight, their breath misting in the cold air as they listened to the impossible sound growing in volume, a spectral infestation seeping into their world. Then came the lights. Faint at first, like will-o'-the-wisps seen through fog, they began to pulse from within the quarantine tent. A sickly, familiar green glow, the same ethereal light that had illuminated the carvings in that impossible trench, now stained the canvas from the inside, casting long, dancing shadows of the silent, standing figures within. It was a sight that should not exist here, miles from the front, in a place of bandages and morphine. The unnatural illumination pulsed in a slow, rhythmic beat, a heartbeat from a world that was not their own, and with each pulse, the whispering grew louder, more insistent, weaving promises of peace and an end to fear that slithered through the cracks in the night. Private Brown, a solid, dependable man who had survived the psalm with his pragmatism intact, was the one who decided to investigate. Dismissing the superstitious fear of the other guards, he reasoned it was a trick of the light, a collective hysteria. He unlatched the tent flap, his jaws set with determination, and stepped inside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the world outside ceased to exist. The air was thick and cold, humming with the same low thrum they had felt in the cavern. The changed soldiers were all standing now, facing him, their hollow eyes fixed upon him, their waxy skin glowing in the eerie green light that had no source. The whispers were a physical pressure here, a cacophony of dead voices that promised him an end to the constant ache in his back, the memory of the gas at Ypres, the face of the friend he'd lost. Brown stood frozen, his rifle lowering. His own fear, his own weariness, became hooks in his soul. He saw Evans take a step forward, not in threat, but in invitation. Brown's head tilted, his own body beginning to sway with a faint, jerky motion. His eyes, once sharp and alert, lost their focus, glazing over as he stared into the collective emptiness of the changed. His right arm twitched, then rose, his fingers curling into a loose fist, mimicking the strange, stiff gesture Jenkins was making. A low, toneless hum escaped his lips, an unconscious echo of the whispering chorus. When Corporal Teague, fearing the worst, rushed in to pull him out, he found Brown standing motionless in the center of the tent, his body already moving with the same marionette stiffness as the others, his eyes beginning to hollow out, the vibrant blue irises fading into the same depthless milky pools. The infection was no longer confined to the trench. It had found a new vessel, and it was learning to spread. The frantic summons brought Dr. Adams from a fitful sleep, his mind still clouded with case notes on gangrene and shell shock. Nothing in his medical training, nothing in the annals of modern science could have prepared him for the scene in the quarantine tent. The air itself was the first assault, a dry, tomb-cold chill that held the faint, sweet odor of turned earth and something else, something metallic and ancient, like ozone after a storm. The changed soldiers stood in a loose circle, their stillness more unnerving than any thrashing seizure. Their chests rose and fell in that slow, synchronized rhythm he had noted upon their arrival, a macabre pantomime of breath in bodies that defied all other signs of life. He began his examination with a clinical detachment that quickly frayed at the edges. His stethoscope, pressed to Evans's chest, found only silence, no lub-dub of a heartbeat, no rush of air through alveoli. The skin was cold and waxy, possessing the inert plasticity of clay. He shone a light into Jenkins's eyes. The pupils were fixed and dilated, showing no reaction, the milky orbs reflecting back the lamplight with a dull mineral sheen. Needles inserted for blood samples met with no flow. The vessels seemingly empty or petrified. They were not comatose, they were biologically inert, a collection of functioning cadavers. They were machines of flesh, operating on a power source that lay far outside the understanding of biology or physics. The whispered phrases that occasionally fell from their lips, the chorus endures, the gateway must be fed, were not the ravings of madness, but the broadcast of a consciousness that had consumed them utterly. It was this chilling, empirical evidence that led him to Sergeant Miller. The sergeant was being held in a separate tent, a man trapped between two worlds, his eyes holding a horror that was both profound and terrifyingly lucid. Dr. Adams confronted him not with the skepticism of the intelligence officer, but with the desperate curiosity of a man who has seen the laws of nature broken. He laid out his findings, the absence of pulse, breath, and neural response, the animate inertia. "What are they, Sergeant?" Adams asked, his voice low and intense. "What did this to your men?" Miller's story poured out then, not as the ramblings of a shell-shock victim, but as a grim, coherent testimony. He spoke of the impossible depth of the trench, the shifting carvings that depicted an ancient, consuming entity, the pulsating heart of light that was a gateway, not a place. He described the parasitic nature of the thing, how it fed on the anguish of the slain, using the mass death of battle as its sustenance, and how it turned the fallen into hollow vessels, extensions of its own will, a chorus of the consumed to lure more prey. He spoke of the mist that healed them, making them nearly invulnerable. It was not a ghost story, it was a field report from a war being waged on a front humanity had never known existed. The truth of it settled on Dr. Adams with the weight of a tombstone. The medical impossibilities, the whispered phrases, the eerie coordination, it all clicked into a dreadful, logical pattern. This was not a disease, it was an infestation of the soul, a metaphysical parasite using human bodies as its vehicles to escape its subterranean prison. He was about to speak, to demand to see Captain Harris, to insist they incinerate the quarantine tent and everything in it, when a scream tore through the night from the direction of the guard's post. They rushed out to a scene of burgeoning chaos. Private Brown, the guard who had investigated the whispers, was no longer a man. His transformation was complete. His eyes were hollow, milk-white pools. His skin had taken on the same waxy pallor as the others, and he moved with the same stiff, unnerving precision. But unlike the passive changed soldiers, he was acting. He had cornered two other guards, his movements a fluid, predatory glide. He made no sound as he attacked, his strength immense and impersonal. He disarmed one man with a twist that shattered the wrist, the crack of bone lost in the other guard's scream. Then, instead of killing blows, he laid his hands upon them. It was not a violent assault, but a terrifying transmission. His cold palms pressed against their temples, and as they struggled, Their screams turned into choked, guttural rasps. Their eyes rolled back, the color draining from their faces in a matter of seconds, their bodies going limp before stiffening anew, rising moments later with the same hollow gaze and synchronized movements as Brown. The change was not just spreading, it was being actively, violently propagated. The entity had learned to use its vessels not just as lures, but as vectors, and the base was now its breeding ground. The chaos of the base faded into a dull, roaring backdrop as the final, horrifying pieces of the puzzle clicked into place within Sergeant Miller's mind. It was not a sudden revelation, but a dreadful, dawning comprehension triggered by the sight of Private Brown's violent transformation. The frantic shouts of uninfected soldiers, the chillingly coordinated movements of the growing horde of the changed, the cold certainty in Dr. Adams's eyes. All of it became a key turning a lock deep in his memory, unlocking the full, terrible story the trench had carved into his soul. His mind flashed back to the vast, pulsating chamber, to the intricate, shifting murals on the porous rock. He saw them now not as ancient art, but as a historical record, a grimoire of damnation. The central, amorphous entity was not a mythic symbol, it was a literal, conscious hunger, a being of pure, predatory will that had slumbered beneath the soil for millennia. The carvings showed it awakening not to random violence, but with a specific, intelligent purpose during times of mass death, the battles of the ancient world, the clashes of empires, the endless grinding slaughter of this great war. They were not coincidences. They were feasts. The entity was a farmer, and the battlefield was its field, the dying soldiers its crop. The trench was not merely a cursed place, it was a carefully maintained silo, a larder where the psychic energy of anguish and terror could be harvested and stored. The process was now horrifyingly clear. The whispers and the lights were its bait, a siren song tailored to the deepest fears and regrets of the living, designed to draw the emotionally vulnerable into its domain. Once inside, the entity did not kill its prey outright. It consumed them, slowly and methodically, siphoning away their consciousness, their memories, their very essence, leaving behind a hollow biological shell. This shell, animated by a shred of the entity's own will, became a vessel, a perfect, durable, and programmable vessel. The possession in the trench was not an end, but a means of escape. The entity was not trapped, it was rooted, a tree that could not move its trunk but could send its seeds on the wind. The changed soldiers were those seeds. They were its way of breaking its geographical confines, of using the bodies of the men it had consumed as vehicles to travel beyond the trench, to find fresh fields of death, new sources of sustenance. Miller saw the carvings depicting the cycle repeating across centuries, a group of Roman soldiers, their eyes hollowed, marching from a forgotten forest battle to spread their silence to a bustling fort, medieval men-at-arms, their skin pale and waxy, leaving a plague-ridden battlefield to walk into a sleeping village. The entity did not just feed on the dead where they fell, it used the dead to create more dead, to spread its influence, to ensure its hunger would always be fed. Their squad's mission, their descent into the trench, had not been an investigation, it had been a delivery of new vessels. They had walked into the entity's mouth, and it had used them to vomit its influence back into the world. The horror was not just what had happened to them, it was the realization that they were now unwilling participants in a cycle of consumption that had defined this patch of ground since the dawn of human conflict, a cycle that their own war had merely continued. The truth was a parasite in itself, burrowing deep into Miller's mind, leaving him with the chilling certainty that they had not discovered a horror, but merely become the latest chapter in its endless, hungry history. The base was no longer a military installation. It was a slaughterhouse where the butchers were the meat. The chaos was a living entity in itself, a symphony of screams, frantic rifle fire, and the chilling, silent coordination of the horde. The changed soldiers moved through the pandemonium with an unnerving, fluid grace, their pale forms gliding through the smoke and shadows like sharks in bloody water. They did not run or charge, they advanced, a placid, unstoppable tide of hollow eyes and waxy flesh, herding the panicked, uninfected soldiers into tightening pockets of desperation. Their silence was a weapon more potent than any bayonet, a void that swallowed hope and amplified terror. They were not fighting a battle, they were conducting a harvest, and the base was their new field. Sergeant Miller, Dr. Adams, and a handful of others, Corporal Teague, who had witnessed Brown's change, and 2 privates named Walsh and Finch, found themselves cornered in a supply dugout, the entrance partially blocked by a shattered ammunition crate. The air was thick with the coppery tang of blood and the acrid smoke of cordite. Through the gap they watched the methodical efficiency of the hunt. A soldier would fire a round into a changed one's chest, the impact doing little more than staggering it for a moment before the ever-present mist coiled in to seal the wound. Then the pale hands would close around the shooter, not to crush or stab, but to transmit the chilling silence. The transformation was swift, a matter of seconds, and then another hollow-eyed soldier would join the ranks, turning its gaze toward its former comrades. Dr. Adams, his face smeared with grime and sweat, turned to Miller, his earlier clinical detachment, replaced by a fierce, desperate intensity. "The trench," he hissed, his voice barely audible over the din. "You said it was a gateway, a connection. It's not just them, it's the source. It's sustaining them, healing them through that mist." Miller nodded, the truth a cold stone in his gut. He had seen it in the cavern, the way the mist had woven Jenkins's body back together. The changed soldiers here were mere extensions, limbs of a body whose heart still beat deep underground. They were fighting the symptoms, not the disease. "The heart," Miller rasped, his throat raw, "the light in the chamber, that's its anchor. We sever that, we might sever this." It was a plan born of absolute desperation, a suicide mission into the very belly of the beast they had barely escaped. But it was the only plan they had. Survival was no longer the goal, extinction was, the extinction of the entity's hold on their world. They scavenged what they could from the supply dugout. Miller and Teague slung Lee Enfields over their shoulders, their pockets bulging with stripper clips. Walsh found a crate of Mills bombs, handing them out like grim party favors. Finch, a former sapper, began bundling sticks of dynamite together with rough cord, his hands moving with a practiced fatalistic speed. They were not an army, they were a demolition crew, armed for one final apocalyptic act. Their objective was clear, a lodestone of dread pulling them back to the one place on Earth they never wanted to see again. They would fight their way out of the overrun base, cross the corpse-littered expanse of no man's land, and descend once more into the impossible depths of the forgotten trench. They would go back to the pulsating heart of the entity, and with their last breath, with their last ounce of high explosive, try to blast its connection to the world into oblivion. The hunt was no longer about the changed cornering the uninfected. It was about a handful of broken, defiant men turning to hunt the hunter, to stalk the ancient, hungry thing back to its lair, and bury it there forever. The command bunker, a low-slung fortress of sandbags and reinforced timber, had become the last redoubt of the uninfected, a fragile island in a sea of placid predatory silence. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sweat, cordite, and a fear so potent it was a taste on the tongue. Sergeant Miller, Dr. Adams, and the handful of soldiers who had rallied to their desperate plan huddled behind the firing slits, their world reduced to the view of the encroaching horde. The changed soldiers did not attack with fury or frenzy. They simply advanced, a silent, coordinated tide of pale faces and hollow eyes, their movements so perfectly synchronized they seemed to be a single organism. They made no attempt to breach the barricaded door or storm the emplacements. Instead, they laid siege with whispers. The sound was not loud, but it was pervasive. A dry rustle that seeped through the cracks in the timber, and the gaps between sandbags, as inescapable as the mist that had coiled in the trench. It was a chorus of promises, each one tailored to the listener's deepest weariness. To a young private trembling beside Miller, it whispered of a warm bed and a mother's embrace, far from the mud and the rats. To Dr. Adams, it spoke of a quiet laboratory, of mysteries solved and a world governed by rational laws, not this screaming chaos. To Miller, it was Eleanor's voice, not from her letters but soft and close, telling him he had done enough, that he could lay down his rifle and his duty and simply rest. The promises were lies, but they were woven from truth, from the very memories and desires the men clung to for sanity. It was a psychological artillery, shelling their morale with their own deepest yearnings for peace. Miller's group fought back with the only language the world above understood. Rifles cracked, the reports sharp and futile in the whispering gloom. A well-aimed shot would strike a changed soldier in the chest, punching a neat hole through its tunic and the waxy flesh beneath. The figure would stagger, its synchronized step faltering for a moment, but it would not fall. There was no cry of pain, no spurt of blood, only a brief pause before it righted itself and continued its advance, the wound already seeming to knit closed in the eerie, ambient half-light. Grenades were more effective, the concussive blasts throwing several of the pale forms backward in a tangle of limbs. But within moments, the others would simply step over or around their fallen comrades, their placid advance unbroken, while the mist that perpetually clung to the ground now would coil over the injured, and they would rise again, whole and unmarked, their hollow eyes locking once more on the bunker. The transformed were nearly invulnerable, their coordination making them a deadly, unstoppable force. Bullets and shrapnel were inconveniences, their healing as inevitable as the tide. Dr. Adams watched the hopeless struggle, his mind, trained for analysis, racing against the tide of despair. He saw the way the mist responded, the way the soldiers moved as one, the way their existence was tied not to their own biology, but to something else, something external. He thought of Miller's description of the cavern, of the pulsating heart of light, of the entity that was not in the soldiers, but used them as limbs. He grabbed Miller's arm, his voice a tight, urgent whisper against the haunting promises. "It's the trench, Miller. Don't you see? We're fighting the branches, but the root is still down there. That light, that heart you described. It's the source. It's sustaining them, commanding them, healing them through this damned mist." His eyes were alight with a terrifying logical conclusion. We can shoot these things until we run out of ammunition, and it will mean nothing. We have to strike at the source. We have to go back. We have to find a way to destroy the heart of the trench. It was the only theory that offered a sliver of hope, a final, dreadful objective in a war that had just been redefined. The siege was not just on the bunker, it was on reality itself, and the only path to victory led back into the mouth of hell. The path back to the trench was a gauntlet through a landscape that had become an extension of the nightmare they sought to destroy. The chaos of the overrun base faded behind them, replaced by the chilling, silent order of the entity's new domain. The changed soldiers were everywhere, not just in the trenches and shell holes, but standing sentinel in the open, their pale forms stark against the churned, muddy earth of no man's land. They did not patrol or search, they simply were, a network of silent, watching nodes, their hollow eyes tracking the small, desperate group's every move. They moved with a placid, unnerving certainty, their steps falling into a rhythm that seemed to vibrate through the very ground, a drumbeat for a war that had already been lost. Miller led the way, his body moving on an instinct honed by years of survival, his mind a fortress walling off the whispering promises that still slithered at the edges of his hearing. Dr. Adams followed, his medical bag swapped for a bandolier of grenades, his face a mask of grim determination. Behind them, Corporal Teague and privates, Walsh and Finch, moved in a tight, nervous knot, their eyes darting, their rifles held ready. They were a speck of defiant life in a sea of predatory stillness. The first sign of active resistance came not as an attack, but as a shift in the network. 100 yards ahead, a line of the changed, perhaps 24 strong, detached themselves from their static posts and flowed together, forming a solid, silent wall across their path. They did not raise weapons or shout. They simply stood, their collective gaze a physical pressure, a declaration that their progress ended here. Finch, the sapper, didn't wait for an order. His hands, already cradling a bundled charge of dynamite, moved with a fatalistic efficiency. He lit the fuse, the sputter of cord a shockingly mundane sound. "Fire in the hole!" he yelled, his voice cracking, and hurled the bundle in a high, arcing throw. It landed in the center of the pale line. The explosion was a brief, violent sun in the gloom, a concussion that threw mud and pallid limbs in all directions. A gaping hole was torn in their ranks, bodies rendered into silent, unmoving ruins. For a moment hope flared. They rushed forward, scrambling over the tattered remains, their boots slipping on the bloodless, waxy flesh. But the trench's influence was stronger here, closer to its source. The ever-present mist, which had been a faint ground haze, now surged forward like a living thing, coiling thick and eager around the shattered forms. They watched, their brief hope turning to ash as the mist knitted the broken bodies back together, weaving pale flesh and shattered bone into whole, unmarked forms. Within a minute, the soldiers they had just destroyed were rising, their hollow eyes blinking once before refocusing, the silent wall reforming behind them, now tighter, more dense. The explosives had cleared a path, but it was a temporary victory, a demonstration of the entity's limitless regenerative power. As they pushed deeper, the very environment began to warp in response to their presence. The whispers, which had been a constant background hum, now grew louder, emanating not just from the air, but from the earth itself. The mud seemed to sigh with the voices of the dead, the shattered stumps of trees creaked with their pleas, and most horrifying of all, the walls of the shell craters they passed began to weep a dark, viscous fluid that gathered into shapes, faces they recognized, mouths opening and closing in silent, screaming sync with the whispers. The entity was no longer merely luring them, it was asserting its dominion, showing them that this entire blighted landscape was now part of its body, its consciousness. The ground itself was against them. The walls had ears and voices, and every step toward the haunted trench was a step deeper into the gullet of a waking, hungry god. The swirling vortex at the chamber's heart was no longer a mere manifestation of light and mist, it was a conscious, predatory storm. It pulsed with a deafening, rhythmic thrum that was less a sound and more a vibration tearing at the fabric of reality, pulling the very air from their lungs. Tendrils of solidified darkness, shot through with veins of sickly green energy, lashed out from its core, not to strike, but to caress the air around the remaining changed soldiers, who stood in a silent, worshipful circle. Evans, Jenkins, Brown, their faces, once familiar, were now masks of serene emptiness, their hollow eyes reflecting the vortex's pulsating hunger. They were not victims anymore, they were acolytes, and this was their altar. Sergeant Miller's body moved on its last reserves, a machine fueled by a final, defiant ember of will. He shoved Dr. Adams and the others toward a jagged outcrop of rock, a pathetic shelter from the psychic hurricane. "Stay back!" he roared, the words torn from his throat and lost in the thrumming roar. His hands were already moving, fingers clumsy with exhaustion and cold, yet sure in their terrible purpose. He unstrapped the bulky canvas-wrapped bundle from his back, the last of Finch's carefully prepared charges, a brutal congregation of dynamite and phosphorus. The weight of it was a promise, the final, logical conclusion to the nightmare that had begun with a captain's orders in a dusty dugout. He did not run toward the vortex, he waded into it, the air growing thick as water, resisting his every step. The whispering chorus became a single, focused command in his mind, a seductive, logical plea for surrender. It showed him Eleanor, not as a memory, but as a promise, waiting for him in a sunlit field beyond all pain. It promised an end to the guilt, the loss, the relentless, grinding horror. The peace it offered was a tangible warmth, beckoning him to drop his burden and simply let go. For a heart-stopping moment, his fingers slackened on the fuse. It would be so easy. Then his gaze swept across the circle of his men one last time. He met Evan's milky, depthless stare, saw the ghost of the cynical soldier he had been. He saw Jenkins's youthful face, frozen in a perpetual vacant calm, a boy who should have been worrying about girls and football, not an eternity of silent communion with a cosmic horror. In their hollow eyes, he did not see peace. He saw erasure. He saw the absolute final victory of the void over everything that made a life worth living: love, memory, struggle, even pain. That was a peace he would not accept, not for them, not for the world. With a raw, wordless cry that was part agony and part triumph, he tore the fuse cord. A spark hissed to life, a tiny brave sun in the consuming green gloom. He took one last lunging step and shoved the entire bundle deep into the base of the swirling vortex, into the very nexus of the light and the dark. The world did not so much explode as unravel. There was no fire, no smoke in the conventional sense. The vortex convulsed, its rhythmic pulse becoming a frantic, shattering staccato. The tendrils of darkness thrashed wildly, lashing the air like dying serpents. The green light flared into an unbearable silent whiteness that bleached the color from the world, etching the scene into Miller's vision for the eternity he would not have. In that final frozen sliver of time, his eyes found his men once more. Their hollow eyes, for the first time, seemed to see him. There was no recognition, no gratitude, no fear, just a final, fleeting connection, a last glimpse of the vessels that had once held the men he had led and failed. Then the whiteness consumed everything. The connection was severed not with a bang, but with a great silent tearing at the root of being, and Sergeant Miller was unmade, his sacrifice a final defiant note of humanity in the eternal hungry silence. The silence that fell was not the absence of sound, but the death of a specific terrible frequency. The world rushed back in, not with a roar, but with the hesitant, fragile sounds of a reality stitching itself back together over a wound. The deafening thrum of the entity's heart was gone, replaced by the patter of rain on mud and the distant mundane thunder of the artillery barrage that had never ceased. In the cavern, the blinding whiteness faded, leaving behind a scorched, hollowed-out chamber, its walls now just stone, the ancient glowing carvings extinguished into mere scratches. The pulsating core was a void, a scar in the air that smoked faintly, smelling of ozone and burnt nothingness. Dr. Adams, Corporal Teague, and Privates Walsh and Finch emerged from behind. The outcrop, their ears ringing in the sudden quiet. They were coated in fine black dust, their faces etched with a shock that went deeper than any shell blast. And then they saw them. The changed soldiers, Evans, Jenkins, Brown, the entire pale, silent host, were collapsing. It was not a fall of death, but a release, like puppets whose strings had been simultaneously cut. They dropped where they stood, their bodies hitting the cold stone with a series of soft, final thuds. The unnerving coordination was gone, replaced by the random, graceless sprawl of inanimate objects. The hollow light in their eyes was extinguished, leaving behind only the dull, empty gaze of the truly dead. The connection had been severed, and the vessels, their purpose fulfilled, were now just corpses. But the victory was hollow, incomplete. As Adams cautiously approached the scorched epicenter of Miller's sacrifice, a cold dread settled in his stomach. The entity was not fully destroyed. He could feel it, a residual presence like a phantom limb, a cold spot in the fabric of the world. The mist, though thinned and listless, still coiled weakly over the fallen, and from the deepest shadows of the chamber, a single, faint whisper echoed, a ghost of the chorus, a promise that this was not an end, but an interruption. "It will sleep," the whisper seemed to say, "and it will dream of feeding once more." Weeks later, In the relative safety of a commandeered chateau far behind the lines, Dr. Adams sat under the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, his pen scratching across page after page of official report paper. He documented it all: the biological inertia of the changed, the regenerative mist, the psychic lure, the parasitic nature of the entity, Miller's final apocalyptic stand. His report was a masterpiece of clinical observation and terrified deduction, a warning screamed into the bureaucratic void. He classified it, stamped it, and sent it up the chain of command, where he knew it would be filed. Away under shell shock, extreme cases, or mass hysteria, its truths too terrible to be believed. The war, after all, had to go on, and it did. The great grinding machine of the front continued its work, consuming men and spitting out statistics. But in the quiet moments between barrages, in the deepest, muddiest trenches, soldiers now spoke in hushed tones of new whispers heard on the wind, of flickering lights in sectors thought to be secure. The horror had been wounded, driven back into its lair, but its hunger remained. A patient, ancient thing waiting in the earth, dreaming of the next great harvest, its silence a more terrifying promise than any scream. The official commendation for Sergeant Miller's posthumous Victoria Cross cited conspicuous bravery in the face of the enemy and a selfless act of sacrifice to protect his comrades. The words were engraved on a slip of brass and mailed to a widow in a quiet English village, where they were placed on a mantelpiece, next to a photograph of a man who would never grow old. It was a clean, noble end, a story the world could understand and file away. Dr. Adams knew the truth was a far more tangled and malevolent thing, a truth that had taken root in his own soul and was now festering in the dark, quiet places of his mind. He had survived the trench, the siege, the last stand, but he carried the entity's legacy within him, a psychic scar that pulsed with a cold, silent dread. His days were spent in the sterile confines of a base hospital, treating shrapnel wounds and trench foot, but his real work began at night. By the guttering light of a single candle, he filled ledger after ledger with his cramped, frantic script. He was not writing reports for the military anymore. He was compiling a testament, a warning for a future that might care to listen. He drew detailed sketches of the carvings, mapping the entity's amorphous form and its history of consumption. He transcribed the exact, toneless phrases whispered by Evans and the others, analyzing them as one would the symptoms of a disease. He documented the properties of the mist, its regenerative capabilities, its sentient behavior. He was building a case against an enemy that official history had already dismissed, creating a Bible of blasphemy in a world that only believed in guns and gas. But the true horror was not in the ledgers, it was in his dreams. Each night, as soon as his consciousness surrendered, he would find himself back in the trench. Not the chaotic, explosive nightmare of the last stand, but the earlier, more insidious version, the endless, winding descent, the glowing carvings that shifted to reflect his own fears, the cold mist coiling around his legs, and always, the whispers. They were different now. They no longer promised peace or offered oblivion. Their tone was one of patient, ancient amusement. They spoke of cycles. They showed him visions of the scarred chamber deep below, not as a hollow, scorched ruin, but as a place where the faintest green ember still pulsed at its heart, like a seed waiting for spring. They whispered of other places, other battlefields across the globe and throughout history, sites drenched in blood, where the ground might be thin, where other gateways might slumber, waiting for the right confluence of mass death and despair to awaken. The entity was not dead, it was dormant, and its hibernation was a strategic retreat, not a defeat. He would wake gasping, his small room drenched in the pre-dawn gray, the taste of tomb dust in his mouth. The whispers did not always fade with the dream. Sometimes they lingered at the very edge of hearing as he dressed, a dry rustle from a shadowed corner, a sibilant sigh from a crack in the floorboards. He would spin around, his heart hammering, only to find emptiness. He knew it was not madness, it was a residue, a connection that his proximity to the entity's heart had forged. He was a beacon, and the thing in the earth, though wounded, could, still sense his light. He was living proof that the severance had been incomplete. The horror had been contained, not cured, and the knowledge was a cancer in his mind. He would stand at the window of his billet, watching the columns of new troops marching toward the front, their faces young and unmarked by the truth he carried. They were fuel for a machine they did not understand, potential kindling for a fire that had been banked, not extinguished. The war would end, he knew. Treaties would be signed, memorials would be built, and the world would try to forget the unimaginable. But Adams knew that forgetting was the entity's greatest ally. In the quiet of the coming peace, in the unmarked graves and the sanitized history books, the horror would gather its strength. It was an eternal, patient thing, and it knew that humanity's capacity for creating fields of death was limitless. The fear did not fade. It settled, deep and cold and certain. It was not a question of if the cycle would begin again, but when. And in the deepest, most silent hours of the night, Dr. Adams was certain he could hear it, dreaming its hunger.